We're going to be talking about international treaties, and particularly the pandemic treaty at the World Health Assembly, which has only just been completed. Of course, there's been a bit of an impasse, so there hasn't been any vote on it, but you might have been following those developments in Geneva, in Switzerland, towards the end of May. There was a push for an international agreement on a global pandemic treaty. And well-known freedom advocate George Christensen, he's just back from Geneva, where he was one of the voices in opposition to a global treaty. The pandemic treaty is seen by many to be a globalist push for control of national health policy and individual health decisions. The pandemic treaty has been postponed. It did hit an impasse at the World Health Assembly, where the WHO's member nations, including Australia, met to determine whether or not it would give a green light. But now it's been pushed to a vote planned for next year, 2025. George Christensen is our guest this coming hour. He's served 3 terms in the Australian Parliament with the LNP. He's been Australian Campaigns Director for CitizenGO, and he was founder of the organisation Nation First. And he was recently elected councillor of the Mackay Regional Council. George, a special welcome back to 2020.
Well, thank you very much, Neil. It's great to be back on your show.
George, you're only just back from Geneva. Describe for us the process. Paint a picture for listeners so they know what was going on there and what was so necessary about you getting on a plane and actually going and advocating against this particular treaty.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. So what happened, I've been back a week now from Geneva, and the days preceding me being there, the World Health Assembly was gathering in Geneva, Switzerland, and that is member organisations, as in countries and their delegates from all over the world who signed up to the World Health Organisation, gathered to vote on a range of measures that the executive of the World Health Organisation had put to them about a new way forward. One of those things was called, colloquially, the Pandemic Treaty. I think its full title is something much longer, Neil. They call it the Pandemic Instrument, but it's also known as the Pandemic Preparedness, Prevention and Response Accord. This document, thankfully, was not passed, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Some of the reasons that countries had in not passing it may have been different to the reasons that I have and that CitizenGO has, and that perhaps many of your listeners might have against the pandemic treaty. Nonetheless, it was important to be there for just to send a message to all of these delegates, and boy, did we send a message. I can talk about that a bit later, but it was important to send a message. We had people from all over the world, from the United States, from Africa, from all over Europe, from Latin America, that were there. And then along with that, there was a huge protest on the Saturday where people from pretty much all over Europe, particularly from the UK, France, they came in droves to protest. And, you know, that's highly unusual, actually. You don't see these protests so much out the front of the United Nations. You see small gatherings, but this was like a full-blown march and demonstration from the peoples of the world against this proposal that was happening there.
I know that there'll be some who will be thinking, what's so sinister about this health treaty? Because, you know, having gone through COVID, some will be saying, of course, this is where you'd expect the World Health Organization to be going to be thinking about some level of international preparation and coordinated effort to prepare to be able to resist any new big threats to humanity. What is it that's so sinister about a globalized idea of having a treaty and being prepared?
Yeah, look, there's two things. One, quite clearly, the proposal as it was originally put forward, and who knows what it'll end up now, with another year of negotiations around ratifying it. But the proposal, as it was originally proposed, was one that would undermine national sovereignty and also undermine personal freedoms, particularly in the space of personal health choices now. And look, I don't think that for anyone that either of those things are something that you would tolerate from a globalist organisation that's not elected by anyone, quite frankly. Now, how did it do that? Well, one of the things that was in here was the ability of pandemic emergencies or public health emergencies to be unilaterally declared by the Director General of the World Health Organization, with him personally appointing a committee of experts that'll, oversee what will go on within nations after that emergency is declared. Things out of this, recommendations that were going to be put forward, were going to be legally binding under international law, which is pretty ephemeral. I've got to tell you, I don't know that there's any international policeman that comes around and arrests you for breaching international law. But regardless, nations sort of abide by it. Well, this was going to be legally binding on nations. We could have had things such as quarantines, lockdowns, isolations, vaccination mandates, mask mandates, country entry prohibitions, contact tracing, all that sort of stuff that we saw during COVID, the worst of the worst, that we're now all saying, why did we do that? Was there really a valid reason to do all of that? I mean, you now have courts and other judicial outfits that are actually coming back on police and authorities saying there was a degree of heavy-handedness here that was not justified. All of that is the kind of thing that could now be imposed not by your state government, not by your federal government, but by people completely removed from you in another country, sitting over there in Geneva, Switzerland, and making decisions that could impact upon your nation and your personal health choices. And Neil, you might ask the question, well, why on earth would the Australian government allow this? And indeed, if you look, the Australian government and their Department of Health have a little flyer that they did up, which was frequently asked questions in response to this pandemic treaty. And it's the first time I've seen a document like this about some international accord. But obviously there was concern about, people like me who are saying stuff out there that this treaty is going to undermine freedom and it's going to undermine sovereignty. And, they're trying to push back against the idea that it would undermine sovereignty, saying, oh, no, the Australian Parliament and state parliaments and governments would still have the ability to pass laws, and any law would be subject to them. Well, that is true, but if you read further in that same document, it also says that the pandemic treaty would impose legally binding obligations on Australia. So in other words, the Parliament would be required to bring in laws that would do this kind of thing, that would give the WHO power. And in fact, we already have the establishment of the Australian Centre for Disease Control now, which is going to be the conduit for most of this stuff. That when the WHO says something, the Australian CDC will tell people how high to jump. That's how it's going to work. So thankfully, we don't have that treaty. We did have the passage of some international health regulations. I can talk about that briefly, but the treaty is not dead, but it's defeated at this point in time.
So that Australian Centre for Disease Control, that's a relatively new initiative too, isn't it, for Australia? Yeah. Whereabouts are our leaders on this? You had the Australian government over in Geneva actually on the side of let's sign this treaty. Is that where it was at? What about our opposition? Was the opposition in favour of that, or were they actually opposing it?
Well, you're spot on with the federal government's approach. The Health Minister, Mark Butler, as every other country was coming out, well, not every other country, but many other countries, including some of our great allies like the United Kingdom, are coming out saying there's no way we're going to pass this in its current form. The Australian government, in its wisdom, the Federal Health Minister came out and declared Australia was completely signed up to it, was going to vote for it, and called on other countries to support it, and that was at its death knell. So that's how signed up the Australian government is to it. As for the opposition, look, we don't know. I suspect that overall there may be maybe not support for it, but nonetheless it's not a high mind issue, and they might just go with the flow. But it remains to be seen, because there are some senators there who stood up amongst the Liberal National Coalition and the crossbenchers, who stood up and said that we should not pass this. And we're talking about people and there was a long list. There was 14 of them from memory, so I'm not going to remember all the names on it. But you had the people who were the ringleaders of this of this list to oppose the pandemic treaty, like Senator Matt Canavan, Senator Rex Antic, Senator Gerard Rennick. But then there were other people whose names are on the list that were fairly prominent people as well, such as Barnaby Joyce, former Deputy Prime Minister. So it may be that a coalition would reject signing up to this, but that remains to be seen.
What about people of faith, George? The Christian, and thoughts of some control mechanism that comes internationally about where a Christian might think of national sovereignty and the things that might impact us by way of, international legal mandates. Is there any sort of dimension here you can pick up on for our listeners?
Well, there is a dimension. I mean, and look, there's a lot in this treaty that was a little bit amorphous. It was chopping and changing at all points. But at one stage there, the World Health Organization was talking about rolling in combating misinformation as part of this. Now, you think, how on earth is that a health issue? But of course, everything becomes a health issue if you can say that free speech, or what people might say using free speech can somehow affect public health. Then you can enact measures to clamp down on it if you don't believe in free speech. And perhaps if we look at that, we could say that there are certain denominations within the Christian faith that have specific beliefs regarding medical treatments, and what they say could be put forward as disinformation or misinformation, and thereby their ability to say it and advocate for those things could be silenced. I mean, that is quite possible under arrangements that a treaty might have to clamp down on what the authorities deem to be misinformation.
Well, we're going to continue our conversation in just a few moments. You might like to ask a question. You might like to even disagree or have your own thoughts, critique for our conversation today. You're welcome to. Our talkback line is open on 1800 316 316. 1800 316 316. You might say a little bit of a reprieve, but it's still on the agenda, and the World Health Organization could well vote on this, the World Health Assembly, sometime maybe this time next year. So 1800 316 316. George Christensen is our guest. We're back with more in just a few moments. And George Christensen is our guest. He was in Geneva for the Health Assembly deliberations and arguing against this sort of treaty that could certainly put regulations and major stipulations on how nations respond to things like international pandemics. Let's talk about some of the regulations that they were discussing, George. International health regulations, what would that look like if Australia was signed up to this and said, we'll just go along with it?
Yeah, well, alongside what they call the pandemic treaty, there was a second tranche of changes that were proposed, and they're called international health regulations. They're the regulations that the World Health Organization has in place to deal with various different things. So a suite of changes that were proposed. And one thing that I did get wrong, and it was actually a big thing to get wrong, I'm sorry, Neil, before, is that the element about the declaration of pandemic emergencies, because this whole thing is quite complex and can be a little bit amorphous at times. Some things overlap. But the key to that was in the international health regulations. Now, I got to say, there's sort of good news, bad news, mixed news in this arena, because they wanted to get something. They realised that the World Health Assembly was going to be just an absolute defeat for the agenda around the pandemic treaty. And so there had to be something salvaged from it to, I guess, have the World Health Organization be able to craft a good press release and tell the world that they actually did something rather than just have something rejected. So what they did is that they rammed through these international health regulations. One of those regulations was about something I talked earlier that I said was part of the pandemic treaty, and that was the declaration of public emergencies or public health emergencies by the Director General of the World Health Organization. Now, that was passed, I got to say, as part of the international health regulations, but it was done at the last minute, and it was done under a cloud of confusion and also a cloud of controversy, in that there are experts saying that actually the passage of that was in breach of the World Health Assembly rules. Why? Well, there was only about a third of member states that were actually in the room at the time of the passage of that international health regulation change. So there's some query around whether or not that is going to have any effect whatsoever, and we'll keep an eye out on that. But nonetheless, they're saying it was passed at this stage, and the reality is Australia now has a year. Well, any organisation or any member state of the World Health Organization has the ability to opt out of the international health regulations in the next year. If they don't, if they say nothing, the amendments automatically take effect in due time. That is a year from now. And you basically then have handed over the ability to declare a pandemic emergency in your own country to the World Health Organization, to Geneva, to Dr. Tedros, who heads the thing. And that's something that I think is just a bridge too far. So, there was bad that come out of it, but at those bad decisions are now, I guess, there's a cloud of controversy over them, given that we're not sure whether they're actually legally passed or not. But the reality is the Australian Parliament has, up until a year from now, the ability to say, no, we don't want those international health regulations to actually be in effect.
So Australia can opt out. The current government position is they're basically opting in.
Yes.
And so when there is a new terminology, now, as you say, these things that when they're brought in at the last minute and passes the Assembly, even though not everyone was there, doubts over whether it's all legally binding, but new terminology around a pandemic emergency. So change the terminology and then you can sort of reset where the agenda is at. Is there something sinister in all of this, do you think, or is it just the normal process of how you actually get to some sort of resolution?
I think that they were desperate to get something positive out of this World Health Assembly, and so they went and did that, even though they knew or suspected that it would be breaching their own rules of the Assembly. Is there anything sinister in it? Look, I don't trust them, Neil. I don't trust any of these globalist outfits. Why don't I trust them? Because there's not a skerrick of democracy involved in the entire thing. None of these people are elected. None of these people are accountable to the public, to average citizens. And therefore, you've got to question everything when it comes from any of these globalist bodies, whether it be the United Nations, the World Health Organization, even think tanks that are quite powerful like the World Economic Forum. They all sit over there in their ivory towers in Geneva dictating laws and policies for the rest of us, and there is just zero accountability about these organisations.
Let me ask you about the hat you wear with CitizenGO And we've mentioned that many a time and had you on before and talking about CitizenGO, and you've been leading the CitizenGO operations here in Australia. CitizenGO is likely to be leading a campaign insofar as this comes over this next year. Is that going to be the place where people will be able to at least get some alternative insights into what's going on there?
I mean, there's been some very good individual researchers that have been looking into the pandemic treaty over the past year. I could name a few. James Roguski comes to mind. But in terms of organisations, CitizenGO has been leading the charge on the pandemic treaty issue now for more than a year. It has been there at every major summit or meeting that they've had, protesting it as and also lobbying those involved in the treaty, against doing it. And so that's been happening for more than a year. And given that they've kicked the can down the road for another year, we will be there every step of the way arguing against it and arguing against international health regulation changes from taking effect in countries around the world, including Australia. So that'll be the direction that we are going in. We see this quite clearly as a threat to national sovereignty, but more importantly, as a threat to international health freedoms when you have the ability of a globalist body to declare things like vaccine mandates for all Australians. It really is beyond the pale as far as I'm concerned and as far as CitizenGO is concerned, because, again, these globalist bodies are not democratically elected. You can almost, there's many arguments against doing it full stop, but at least you can mount an argument that if a government, a democratically elected government, imposes a mandate for something, you can say, pardon the pun, that government has a mandate to do that because it's elected by the people. Now, I actually would disagree with that. I think that personal freedoms trump any sort of democratically elected mandate, but nonetheless, there is no democratic mandate for the World Health Organization. And for them to be imposing mandates and whatnot on the Australian public is just something that this can't be tolerated as far as I'm concerned.
We're taking calls on 1800 316 316. Let's take a call. Chris is in Melbourne. Hey, Chris, welcome along.
Good day, Neil and George. Yeah, I hope like George and CitizenGO are taking note of what's happening in America and the Philippines, where Fauci is being grilled by Marjorie Taylor Greene, and social distancing is being proved useless. Masks are being proved useless. In the Philippines, they're showing that vaccine injuries to children are turning them into 60-year-olds. And in Portugal, the PCR test by 4 German holiday makers was proved to be so unreliable, 99% unreliable. So these, it looks like more like everybody thought AstraZeneca is taking the vaccine off the market, and it was just a big scam by the elites to make money.
Chris, breaking up a little, and we are on our way to news in just about a minute and a bit. Quick response here from George, picking up some things that Chris is sharing there.
Yeah, I'm aware of what Chris is sharing, and as is the CitizenGO organisation. And it's interesting that a lot of these things many of your listeners might be going, what's that all about? Well, in the US, they've been grilling Anthony Fauci, who was a lot of the architect of a lot of the measures that other countries adopted. He's admitted that the 6 metre rule was just something that was made up pretty much. He's admitted a lot of other things there, and people might want to look at some other sources, other news sources to get information. And in the Philippines, they are doing a major investigation in their Congress at the moment into the effects of these jabs on children. And that's very interesting. It's eliciting some information that may have the vaccine companies in hot water in the Philippines, at least anyway.
Okay, well, we're about to break for news. I want to thank Chris from Melbourne for those insights. 1800 316 316, a question, a comment, even a critique. George, take us back to actually being on the ground in Geneva, the sorts of things that were bubbling along. You said there were protests and all sorts of things on the streets, which is quite unusual for European countries to be out on the streets and protesting on an issue something like this. On the ground, what stands out as the sorts of things, the messages that were being delivered?
Yeah, well, the protests on that Saturday were unusual for Geneva. They do have small demonstrations, but that was from other colleagues that were there. They were who've been to Geneva before. They said this was something else. But what was also something else was the bus that CitizenGO had travelling all throughout European cities that ended up in Geneva for the World Health Assembly. Now, there would not have been a delegate who was in attendance there in Geneva that would not have seen this bus, a big bright blue bus that had written on the side of it, "No to the pandemic treaty, stop the UN power grab." That was written on the front and the back and the sides and everywhere. And it was basically circling around and around and around the sort of square where the just outside the United Nations building, the famous one you see with all the flags that go down to the front entrance there. Anyway, we were, as in CitizenGO campaigners, were assembled there, and with our signs and placards and banners, and people were stopping and talking to us, taking photos. We had one of the major conservative US alternative media organisations, Turning Point America, actually there interviewing us. But then it started raining, so we took shelter underneath a bus shelter, and it was then that we spotted police lights flashing, and we saw our bus had been cordoned off and stopped in the middle of the road. So we run over, what's going on? Well, the police had stopped the bus because of a complaint that came from within the United Nations that a bus was circulating near the UN building that was spreading propaganda. Now, I didn't know that was an offence that police would stop you for, spreading propaganda, but in Geneva it was, and they proceeded to question, take photos, take details of names and passports and all the rest of it, and then let us on our way when they saw that everything was in order. But that didn't just happen one day. The second day, when we went there to protest as well, once again, 2 police officers turned up with complaints that emanated out of the United Nations that we were somehow disrupting the peace by being there, and even though that we had permits to be there, that were signed by the local authorities. And again, once again, the police took names and details and passports and all the rest of it, passport details. So it just shows you that there's an element within the United Nations that does not like any idea of dissent, any idea of protest, any idea of opposition to their events, to their policies and programs. And in fact, because I've become hyper paranoid at that point in time, I saw one guy taking photos of the bus after the police incident. And I thought, this might be an innocent bystander just wanting to check it out. And I don't know why, but my spidey senses went up, and I sort of observed this guy for a while, only to find out he had a UN lanyard on. And when I saw the badge, it was a UN security badge. So they were out in force, just upset that we were there protesting their agenda. Very weird, Neil. Very, very weird.
Because an effective protest, when it's a global issue that is being debated, could have global consequences if that all gets out of control, and there's a viral, media coverage that goes around the world that could detract from what the UN was trying to achieve. Let me ask you here, though, because, when we talk about international treaties and covenants and such things, sometimes we'll make a reference to one of those called the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and Christians will say we'll draw on those elements in something like that to maintain our freedoms. The alternative here seems to be the opposite direction, because the alternative is against freedoms when you're talking about the sort of treaty with a health treaty here or a pandemic treaty. Any thoughts here on the value of these international covenants and treaties? Because sometimes we say they're good and in this occasion arguing they're bad.
I think that a lot of the international covenants that came out with the establishment of the United Nations probably wouldn't see the light of day today because of the things contained within them that you said, the right of freedom of expression, the right of freedom of assembly. For instance, the things in that document, it would be that document and another document, the international rights of children, which talk about every child having the right to life. That sort of language now would be bitterly opposed by elements within controlling elements within the United Nations and the World Health Organization, Neil. So I think that that organisation, as much as there might have been legitimate criticisms of where their agenda might go at the start, it certainly is now hell west and crooked today. So I think that anything coming out of the UN, World Health Organization, and any other globalist body like that probably needs to be either thoroughly scrutinised and have all of the hairs removed from it, or rejected these days, because there's not too much good that's coming out of those outfits.
Well, we're taking calls. 1-800-316-316. You might like to have your say, a question, a comment, even a critique for our conversation. Let's take another call. Tim is in Red Bank Creek in Queensland. Hey, Tim, welcome.
And g'day, George. Congratulations on your election to council, mate.
Thank you very much.
I think in regards to the COVID-19 pandemic, I sort of went along with everything, got vaccinated. Like all the media organisations seem to be pushing the same line and seem to pull the wool over our eyes. For me, my opinion changed regarding the forced vaccination on the population when Novak Djokovic wanted to come into the country. He'd actually had coronavirus and recovered, so he would have had immunity, but there still seemed to be this just draconian push to get him vaccinated. That's where I started to question what was going on. In regards to what's happening with the globalist push surrounding many policy areas of the government, I think the referendum on the voice to Parliament highlighted just that the Australian population aren't as trusting as what the government would have you believe. There seemed to be a lot of there was a failure to disclose what the voice is actually about, and I think the government miscalculated how compliant the population is in Australia. I'd like to think that people will have their eyes open to what's happening with this World Health Organization agreement that's being pushed. What are your thoughts surrounding those issues, George?
George?
Yeah, look, it's a very good point, actually. I mean, I think that what was just said there is spot on, that the powers that be in Canberra thought that the voice would sail through. But when the Australian public were asked a question and started to do their research into that question, and they realised that the answer was not good, they rejected it. And they rejected it of the likes you've never seen before, 60-40 against, and in places like where I'm from, 80-20 against. So I think that when a question is actually asked to the Australian people, and how often is that done in politics, right? Hardly ever, we're just dictated to and we just have to lump it. But when we're actually asked something and we get to do our research and we get to listen to all points of view, we're often pretty sceptical as a people. We're pretty sceptical. And that's a good thing sometimes, because, you don't fall for whatever agenda is put in front of you. And I think that something like this pandemic treaty, which is in the international health regulations, which are going to be major changes to the way that we run our health services in Australia, that we make health decisions in Australia, that things like this should be put before the people. If something's coming from an unelected body that's thousands of kilometres away from us, then there's got to be the imprimatur of democracy and sovereignty over it. So put it to the people. They never will do that. But I would say that the only way it would have legitimacy is if the people of Australia rubber stamped it, and they won't, which is why there'll never be an attempt to do that.
Thanks so much to Tim in Redbank for your insight. Just to touch on this for a moment. An Australian strength that we don't roll over easily, although our reputation internationally took a big hit, didn't it, during the pandemic when it looked like Australia had rolled over very easily under the mandates. But as you say, when we are asked, we are often sceptical. But how do we get asked a little more here? I mean, I guess, talkback radio is one way that people have a voice. That's not always straight into the corridors of power. But what are your thoughts here, George? How do you speak up and make your voice known? Is there some sort of mechanism, some citizens' assemblies and things like that we ought to be asked more about the issues that are confronting the nation?
Oh, look, 100%. And with every hat that I have, whether it be, CitizenGO or council or whatever, personally, my view is I've always been in favour of the kind of democracy that they call direct democracy, where on substantial matters that the populace are asked via a referendum or plebiscite. And you can even go so far with that where the populace can actually come up with initiatives, citizens-initiated referenda or initiative referendums, where the citizens actually propose laws and they can then be voted on and passed. And, that can go either way. We've seen tax cuts in the US because of that, and states that have it. And we've also seen marijuana fully legalised in other states. So there's swings and roundabouts depending on your point of view. But ultimately that is I think a purer form of democracy than just simply representative democracy, which has become a little bit polluted by the fact that political parties, particularly in Australia, now have such rigid control over our representatives, and often those political parties are also have globalist influences put upon them as well. So, look, I'm a big supporter of direct democracy, Neil, but that's probably a tale for another time.
It will be. Hey, let's take another call. Our talkback line's open on 1800 316 316. Let's hear from, I think it's Lambos in Hobart in Tassie. Hello, Lambos, is it? Is that the way I pronounce your name?
Yeah, that's correct. How are you, buddy?
Good, Lambos. What are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I'd just like to congratulate George on his trip to Geneva, and I want to actually just give him support. That there's a lot of people supporting him in his direction, because there's a lot of people that aren't speaking up. I feel that are cornered and feel that they're powerless because it's only me or it's only one person. I personally think, without getting too deep into it, I think our politicians across the country, as well as Hobart, have lost the plot. And if they've been voted in to do a particular job, and then they're passing on their responsibilities to another person or another entity, why are we voting them in the first place if they're only passing on their commitment and their job? They're obviously not capable of doing the job. Step down, let someone else do it.
Good point, Lambos. Let's get a thought or two here from George, because if we elect politicians to represent us, they've handballed their responsibility to an international treaty. That doesn't sound like the sort of democracy that we might think is effective if we're electing representatives. Thoughts here, George, for Lambos?
He's 100% correct. I mean, and you can see it across many issues, this pandemic treaty, but even let's talk about something that I was been campaigning about for a long time, and CitizenGO have been campaigning about, the digital ID bill. I mean, I've said it once, I've said it a million times, Neil, that no one in Australia has woken up in a sweat in the morning thinking, oh, goodness, I don't have a digital ID. You know, no one stopped their politician in the street, phoned them, emailed them, had a meeting with them saying, we want a digital ID, or I want a digital ID. So where has it come from? It's come from overseas. It's come from international or globalist bodies that have been pushing this agenda, such as the United Nations and the World Economic Forum. And it's wormed its way into the circle that is Australian democracy. It hasn't come from Australian democracy. It's been imposed from the top down. And basically then you've almost you've almost contracted out your policy development process to an unelected, unrepresentative globalist elite, and you're now bringing that in and imposing it on the Australian public. That is not how representative democracy is supposed to work. Laws are supposed to be from the ground up in representative democracy, not from the top down. But that's more and more what we're seeing at this stage. And I'm going to say, Neil, my fear is that that's a return to neo-feudalism. That's not representative democracy in the slightest.
Lambos in Hobart, thank you so much for your call, and just a few minutes remaining for our conversation. A return to neo-feudalism, the thought that if everyone on all sides of Parliament acknowledges God and that there are some laws that never change, then you've got something to work with by way of making the best harmonious, civilised, organisational nation. But when you remove God from the mix, you've got the idea of control being up to every individual and every group that wants to combat and be a part of the process. So if we're bringing back to something of a faith issue here, there is something important and special about the kingdom of God, that God is king, that our consciences are free because our consciences are free before God. Any thoughts here around the things that we might have been seeing, a slippery slope and such things?
Well, Neil, I hear your argument is very well articulated. That's why you do so well in this public square, when you're bringing, trying to shine a Christian light on issues in the public square. And look, the one thing that I think we've got to worry about is function creep as Christians. Now, you might not think there's an issue to do with pandemics. You might not think that there's a Christian issue here, and perhaps there isn't. That might be up for debate. But I would hasten to think that there's not a Christian issue with the life question. Now, look, the World Health Organization has just tried to give itself the ability to declare not just pandemic emergencies, but public health emergencies worldwide. So what else does the World Health Organization subscribe to? Well, I can tell you that they are completely and utterly subscribed to the proliferation of abortion globally. They believe that is key for women's health, gender equality in health, and all the rest of the buzzwords and jargon that you hear ascribed to the killing of unborn babies now. And what's going to happen? I mean, I don't know. I don't think they will have any power at the moment, but function creep, eventually it could be pushed further into other areas, and maybe eventually the World Health Organization might get power in terms of this area to declare women's health a public health emergency, and so that all countries now have to have abortion on demand right up until birth. I mean, in Australia, we pretty much already have it, so it would mean no change here, but countries throughout Africa and the Philippines, where democratically elected governments have said no to that agenda, which is essentially bringing about the culture of death on their society, that they will be usurped. And are going to say that as a result, God's innocent children will be destroyed. And that quite clearly would be a Christian issue. So that's where centralisation of power becomes a very, very dangerous thing. And I think that we've got to recognise as Christians that it is a dangerous thing.
So a resistance to globalisation when it comes to health issues, various mandates that could be imposed legally on nations that signed up to these sorts of things that we're discussing today about a pandemic treaty. And I guess it is good news. It has been delayed, but there's likely to be another vote next year. So no doubt we'll be talking about that in the lead up to it and noting where Australian politicians and government and opposition might be sitting according to that. I did mention a little earlier CitizenGO, and CitizenGO, it's not just something that's a local organisation. You've been wearing your CitizenGO cap, George, but CitizenGO is in the US, and what other nations around the world are there bases for CitizenGO and all of this information? You might even call it intelligence being gleaned and shared so that people can have a Christian foundation for their thinking. Thoughts here? How far is it proliferated around the world?
It's come out of Spain. It's right across Europe, the UK, the Americas, Latin America, and now Australia is spreading into Asia. So it's an international movement which is all about defending and promoting life, family, and freedom. So if people want more information on it, they can go to citizengo.org and become a member of that movement.
And it is good for us to be able to connect with those organisations that are dealing with things here in Australia and to have connection to CitizenGO, which has this global focus too on what is developing around the world. There is a website, you can check on that, citizengo.org. citizengo.org. They use often online petitions, action alerts as a resource to defend and promote life, family and liberty. CitizenGO.org, and George Christensen has been campaigns director for CitizenGO here in Australia. He's also recently elected councillor of the Mackay Regional Council. Just quickly, George, just a few seconds here, but how's all that going? You're back in council in Mackay.
Yes, and we get in trouble now if we say that we're speaking on behalf of, or if we don't say that we're not speaking on behalf of Mackay Regional Council. So I've got to say that first before I mention anything to do with that. I'm not speaking on behalf of Mackay Regional Council, but I can tell you it's a different world. When I was a local government councillor 20 years ago, there are a lot more rules in place about what councillors can and can't do, but it's a challenge. It's a challenge to try and get stuff done for your local community, but it's a challenge that I'm happily taking on for the next 4 years and that I'm sinking my teeth into anyway now.
Well, George, we'll look forward to another update, and probably not on Mackay Regional Council issues, but probably on some of these bigger international globalist agenda type issues that we know you like to follow, and always appreciate the fact that you can bring a Christian dimension to that too. And a lot of listeners will be surprised to know that you have a degree in theology to be able to bring those dimensions to the fore as well. George, thanks so much for sharing these thoughts with us today on 2020.
Thank you very much, Neil.